Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Syrian Analysis. Today, we're going deep into the real story of the war in Syria. Some say on Syria, the role of the US and its allies, the covert war in Damascus, the rise of ISIS, and how great powers used Syria as a testing ground for modern warfare. My first guest is Matthew Murphy. Matthew is a current executive at an intelligence and paramilitary contractor. He is a retired US Army Green Beret, Special Forces sniper, and unconventional warfare expert. He speaks Arabic in both Levantine and modern standard dialects and is a veteran of wars in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. After the military, Matthew founded Operation Light Shine, a nonprofit whose mission is to combat human trafficking and pedophilia. He left Operation Light Shine in 2023 to become president of the Sentinel Foundation, where he built out a strategic intelligence and operational approach to fight trafficking and exploitation inside the US. He left the Sentinel Foundation in December 2024 to focus full-time on a career in private military and intelligence contracting. My second guest is Kamal Alam. Kamal specializes in the contemporary military history of the Middle East. He was a fellow at the United Services Institute, from 2015 to 2019. He is currently a fellow at the Institute for Statecraft and was a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he lectures at several military staff colleges across the Middle East. Kamal served as an advisor to the former Chief of Defense Staff of the British Army and advised the Army for over 10 years on Middle Eastern and Afghan issues. He was also part of the Saudi-Pakistan security dialogue with the Syrians during the war. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. Your CVs and credentials are so impressive that I feel like I have to learn a lot today from you. So I'm so excited and thankful that both of you joined Syrian Analysis.
Well, first off, thank you for having us, and very excited to have this conversation. And hopefully we can bring some clarity to a lot of people around the world about how all this happened, and maybe some insight on where all this goes.
Indeed. I would like to start with you, my friends, with the U.S. involvement in Syria, the official versus the real aims in this case. And I think I would like to start this with Matthew. Matthew, you have been inside the machine, special forces, CIA-connected work, and now private contracting, and you operated in and around Syria. When you look back now, how would you describe the real U.S. objective in Syria as you experienced it on the ground? What were you told by your superiors to do, and what do you now think you were actually doing in the country?
Well, definitely. I think to start this, you have to go back to all the way to 9/11. The attacks on 9/11, and then the following war on terror, and the invasion of Iraq, and then Afghanistan, that really started the destabilization of the Middle East. And so, I went into Iraq for the first time not until about 2007, 2008, and the whole part and purpose of this was to bring quote unquote democracy and freedom to the Iraqi people and free them of the oppressive Saddam regime. That was the narrative. And what we all know looking back now was all we did was create chaos, create never-ending sectarian violence, faction on faction inside of Iraq. And then as that war I would say occupation continued, what it did is it pushed a lot of the hardened fighters and a lot of the guys who had the experience of fighting the U.S. military out of Iraq into Syria. And that was really what led to the birth of ISIS and a lot of other extremist groups. So, looking back on my involvement in this, from being an infantry guy to a Green Beret to contracting with the CIA to multiple different levels, and still in ways involved in conversations and operations today, I don't think anyone actually really knows the true agenda of this, because I think there's layers, right? It's when you talk about, foreign policy, I look at foreign policy kind of like an onion that has to be peeled back. And, you always have the outside of the onion that everyone sees, and I would say that's sprinkling the freedom and democracy. And then you peel a layer back, and then you actually start to see that there's corporate objectives. It's oil, it's gold, it's control, the geopolitical objectives. the religious objectives. And then you get down to the center of that onion, which is actually where it all starts. And, in my opinion, now I believe that Israel is behind all of this. This is my opinion. This is not the U.S. government's policy. This has not been publicly said. But when you look at agendas, and going back to 9/11, from the involvement of the dancing Israelis, if you will, that were dancing as the Twin Towers fell, to the Israeli art students that had, art exhibits set up inside of the Twin Towers, to the Zionist ownership of the Twin Towers, the insurance policy, how every Jewish or Zionist person just didn't go to work that day. When the Twin Towers fell, to how the buildings fell exactly like a controlled demolition, so. That really is where my thoughts on all of this start. Because you can't talk about what's happening, you have to go back to how it started. And I think that's the crucial piece to really understand, because why did it start? How did it start? And then look at, from that angle on, who does this benefit? Because this in no way benefited the U.S. We lost thousands of American lives. We killed hundreds of thousands of what I would say are innocent people. Millions more died as a result of these conflicts, from the invasion of Iraq, the occupation of Iraq, to the Arab Spring. So when I look at the whole story, and it's way too much to unpack in an hour or two, what I really see is just a complete lack of direction by the Obama administration. The Bush administration, I believe, invaded Iraq with false intelligence. We all know that. The weapons of mass destruction, all of the nonsense around that narrative from the Iraqi source, who turned out to be a womanizing drunk who was just trying to get money, right? And then the next thing you were in it. And, so I'm not going to be too critical or harsh of Bush and the involvement, because you have all the deep state and everything going on in that. But I think where all this took a turn and really went south was once Obama got into office. I think that is when the U.S. policy completely collapsed. And that's really where my involvement started, was in the collapse of U.S. policy, complete lack of direction, instruction. And then you had multiple entities in the U.S. government and foreign governments fighting their own proxy wars in Iraq and in Syria. And so, I can speak from my perspective, my involvement, and talk about everything that I saw around me. But what I saw was it was a clown show. You even had U.S. forces, from intelligence to special operations to our Tier 1 units, literally, and then their proxy armies fighting each other in Syria, shooting missiles and things at each other. And I laugh about that now, because you're just like, well, hey, at least we didn't kill each other. But that's really what it ended up being. It ended up being 3 different U.S. forces fighting each other on the ground in Syria, until President Trump came into office and, in my opinion, fixed this.
There is also a report back in the day, I think this was in 2015, that Pentagon-funded groups were fighting CIA-funded groups in Syria. There was like a civil war of American proxies on Syrian soil. I mean, nowadays we laugh. Nowadays we laugh about it, but it just shows the absurdity of this proxy war, which prolonged so much for 14 years, and now we have the cherry on top of the cake, and that is Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani is in power, unfortunately for the Syrians and for us as well. Kamal, my friend, from your vantage point as an expert in the contemporary military history of the Middle East and advisor to senior military figures, how do you explain Washington and London's decision to make the quote Assad must go in this as the central slogan in 2011, 2012? Was this as they claimed, about democracy, or it was about regional engineering, or something closer to what Kissinger predicted about Syria's pivotal role in war and peace?
Thank you, Kifo, for having me, and great to be on with Matt. I think, David Cameron gave an interview to Atlantic Magazine. Obama gave an interview to Atlantic Magazine whilst he was president. And it's the first time in the history of US-UK relations that a sitting US president criticized a sitting US prime minister. So basically, Obama said, don't blame me for Syria and Libya. I blame the British, and in brackets, the French. The UK have been, I think, the most knee-deep country in trying to get rid of Assad and Syria. There's no rational sense behind it, because 3 former British ambassadors in the first 6 months said, what are we doing here? You mentioned Kissinger, because a lot of my lectures around these militaries, I was saying, let's not ignore Kissinger. And even now, for the audience and the viewers, if they want to just Google Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Brent Statecraft, 3 of America's most important national security advisors post-World War II, all of them were in video in a Senate hearing saying, we don't understand what's the need of funding an armed opposition against Assad. This will lead to disaster. So these are America's 3 most prominent national security advisors who were telling Obama, don't do this, telling the British, don't do this. So there is no rationale behind it. But one thing is for sure, if it is to fit into getting rid of the last Arab army, and the last state, as they say, I wrote an article about the last Arab standing. All the other countries were neutralized. Well, as Matthew said, the Wesley Clark plan, Syria was the last Arab country remaining, and then of course Iran being the non-Arab. So I think there was that plan. The Arab Spring, all the mechanisms of whether you're using NGOs or media. And the thing is, now we live in a world where you can't hide stuff. 20, 30 years ago, no social media, you can do, or even regular media in wars. Now, with how much embedding you have in war zones, it's very hard to hide the truth. And I think Syria was one of probably the most dirtiest wars in history. No war is ever clean. But I would go as far as to say, having looked at Afghanistan and been in both wars, the Syrian war makes the Afghan war looks clean, which is, and this is going back to the Afghan war of the 80s, when, of course, all the Arab jihadis were taken to Afghanistan, from the bin Ladens of the world to the North Africans to the Egyptians. And if it was about human rights, let's be honest, to this day, the last head of the Syrian Arab army was British educated. 3 former heads of Syrian intelligence are British educated. And after 9/11, when they wanted someone to be tortured, they said, oh, let's send him to Syria. So you had all these rendition flights because they're like, oh, Syrians are the best at this, and the Egyptians, so let's use, and there was no issue there. Tony Blair famously lands in Damascus, along with Jonathan Powell, his former chief of staff, who's now Britain's national security advisor, a very close friend of Jilani. So it's not a coincidence. They knew everything about it. It wasn't about democracy. And if it is about democracy, let's be honest, there are many other allies of the US and UK who don't come anywhere close to democracy or human rights standards. So it's never been about that. And the Brotherhood. If you ask the Egyptians and the Emiratis, the British are the biggest supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood all across the Arab world. And I think in that sense, this is a leverage used to control the Middle East.
Since the 1920s, actually, the Brits were one of the main supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood when the Egyptians resisted politically, and also they were trying to organize some sort of military resistance against the British mandate. Those were mostly the nationalists, the socialists back then in Egypt. So in order to find a natural foe, an enemy for the people who resisted against the British mandate, you prop up or you allow let's say, the spawning of another organization that is a natural enemy of the people who are fighting against you. And those were the Islamists or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt back then. And this has been being copied so many times in the modern history in different places in the region, to the extent that we have now Jolani as an acceptable figure in the eyes of the Brits, let's say, or the British government. And also they are assets for the British intel inside the Syrian presidential palace. Some of them never stepped foot inside Syria. They never saw Syria in their entire lives. They were second or third generation of Muslim Brotherhood activists, and now they're in positions of power inside the presidential palace as advisors, as ambassadors, a special envoy or the permanent envoy of Syria to the United Nations. He's a very famous he's a son of a very famous Muslim Brotherhood, also a man. So this investment has worked for quite a long time. But when I watched the video of Matthew, this is a segment, guys, I want to show you. Matthew has on the in the Blind podcast. And this is mind-boggling what he says. We have been arguing this for quite some time, but coming from Matthew, I think this is very, very rich. We have to listen to this.
There's so many things I can't say. Yeah. I'll tell you this because I don't care about saying it, because it's probably one of the things that weighs my soul the most is I was one of the guys that created ISIS. We created ISIS. Yeah. That's just a fact. It's been released, and people are talking about it now, but I was the asshole doing it. There's been a lot of nights where I've sat up and thought about God knows how many, I did what I was doing what I was told, even as a Green Beret and a CIA guy, puts lotion on his skin,
Right. Following orders,
and I don't want to make light of that, but dude, you do what you're told, but you're also not told the whole truth when you're doing what you're told, right? Everything's compartmentalized. There's all
manipulation.
these pieces, manipulation, and you're told you're doing this for this reason. I mean, they even lie to you,
Right.
when you're in the machine of the lies, So just looking back at my career, man, it's most of the things that I have done had nothing to do for America. It did nothing to make my daughter safer, my family safer, our city, our state, our country safer. It did nothing for that. It was an oil game. It was a business play. It was to keep money funneled into the military industrial complex.
That's always about money.
It was always about money, man. At the end of the thing, everything is money.
Matthew, in this conversation, you said very bluntly, I was one of the guys who created ISIS. We created ISIS. In practical operational terms, what did that mean? Walk us through how training, arming, and moving fighters in Syria actually worked back in the orders, who your local partners were, and what you were told about why this was necessary.
Right. Now, so first of all, there was never a directive that I saw that said create ISIS, right? Or a U.S. military CIA intelligence directive. But what we did is create ISIS, intentionally, unintentionally, you can leave that up to the powers that be. But it's very well known. We had the training and equipping program, early in the day to destabilize the Assad regime. President Trump famously ended that program in 2017 and publicly acknowledged we did it and talked about it. So I'm not worried about talking about it today. Of course, there's details I'm just going to leave out but that's just the way it is. But at the end of the day, we were equipping and training, Syrian fighters. And I know the number one recruiting ground for these guys was people who had been affected by the Assad regime, the firebombing attacks that were happening on the villages. So many of these guys had lost their children, had lost their wives. Their whole life decimated, their livelihood, their work, their businesses, their stores, everything just destroyed. So at that time, what Assad was doing to quell the rebellion and the uprising and the resistance was creating more fighters, right? Especially more guys that were just like, I have nothing left. My wife is dead. My children are dead. I'm ready to go kill somebody. So I think the Obama administration and intelligence agency, of course, took advantage of this, saw that Assad was creating the fighters for us, essentially. So we would take them places, train them, equip them, and then send them in. And, the biggest problem with that is, at that time, Assad still had a relatively well-functioning military. He still had the jets and the helicopters, the bombs, the missiles, all the big boy stuff. And we were giving these guys, nonsense, AKs, Dushkas, maybe the biggest machine gun they would have would be like a ZPU. And then eventually the anti-tank weapons kind of entered the battlefield, shortly after the program started. But what we were doing was sending these guys in and saying, hey, good luck, go do this. And, trying to destabilize the Assad regime. But all we were really doing was just getting them massacred, to be perfectly honest. I think the first few groups sent in, they all died within 24 hours. It was, but you're doing your job. You're at that point, I believe we were trying to do the right thing because, I'm sitting with these guys and, I speak their language. I'm breaking bread with them. I'm smoking the cigarettes with them every night, drinking the chai, developing this relationship. And you start to, you have to create, a barrier of this because, you're doing your job and they're fighting their war. But, you start to realize it just kind of sucked. You knew like every group you're sending in, well, they're about to go die. and most of them had 24 hours to live. So as this program continued, a lot of these guys took the equipment, everything that we gave them, the training, especially famously you've seen all those, white Toyota Hiluxes that Syria was flooded with the Dishka mounts in the back. All of that came from that program. And, Trump famously called that out and said, we screwed up. Because what we did is we took guys who had lost everything and trained them, equipped them, and gave them everything they needed to go, quote unquote, fight for their country, avenge their children, avenge their wives, avenge their homelands. And all we ended up really doing was getting them killed because there was no support. There was nothing. It was not like any other type of effort that the U.S. has done, because there was no top cover. There were no U.S. fighter jets helping them out, providing, the ground support for that. There was no, U.S. entity at all fighting any fire support. So it was just guys in, Toyota trucks with Dishkas in the back, maybe a couple anti-tank missiles and a bunch of AKs waging war against a formidable military. And, they lost every time. So what these guys ended up doing was all starting to defect. And, there were multiple groups. Al-Nusra was a big one too. And then ISIS that was literally taking them in and funneling them. So I would say, the timeline is still a little foggy. I got blown up a lot during this project. But there's, you start to see that these guys just kept funneling into al-Nusra, they kept funneling into ISIS, and then ISIS got all of the equipment magically, that Obama was having us give them. And Obama just kept it going. No matter how many times we told him, it was like, hey, this is not working out. We are literally building ISIS. And so when you look at my statement of creating ISIS, well, one, we train most of the fighters, because there's been multiple ISIS videos I've watched, and I've been like, oh shit, I know that guy, or I trained that guy, and it's just like, you're just like, fuck, man, and sorry for cussing, but that sits heavy on your soul, man. Because, I'll never forget one night, we were doing an anti-tank missile thing, and we were teaching them how to shoot the anti-tank missiles, which, Trump had talked about us giving them. And they hit this, we were in the desert, and they hit this Air Force pallet that was like, we set up as a target about 1,500 meters away. And, there's, a couple hundred of these guys. And once one of their guys hit this pallet with this missile, they acted like they had just won the damn war, man. Tears pouring down their faces, arms go over there. They picked me up and carried me across the desert dancing, like we had just won the national championship, And man, so it started to really, that's when it really started to hit home, of just how this program was going, where it was going. Because, I'm not a policymaker. I'm not I'm not one of the guys that, makes the decisions. I'm not a politician. I'm not part of the deep state, but I'm the guy on the ground, trying to make life better for my wife at the time and my kids. And here I am, taking advantage of really guys that had just lost their wife and their children. They're trying to take back their homeland. And I knew very well they were all going to go die or become terrorists, But, hey, enjoy this night, carry me across the desert, man. So a lot of those things, weighed on my soul. But the overall bigger picture of this is simply that, we created ISIS from the start of, the invasion of Iraq, because every time you kill someone's father, that kid's going to become a freedom fighter or a terrorist, depending on, which side of this, you're looking at it from. Every time you kill, someone's child, you just turn that man into a terrorist or a freedom fighter, depending on the perspective, right? So the continuation of this war, the occupation, the senseless death, the nonstop death that happened, in Iraq, for what cause, for what reason? And Iraq is still a mess to this day. And then you look at Syria, which is now being led by ISIS. It's like, what was all of this for? What was all of this death for? What was all of this destruction for? And I went on to work on future programs. I'm sure that we'll get to and another thing. But that program was literally what gave ISIS all the firepower it needed to go from just a bunch of angry another regular run-of-the-mill terrorist group to becoming probably the most formidable terrorist group that the world has ever seen. The training, the equipment, and all that stuff. And to me, that was a catastrophic failure by the Obama administration. Because again, the CIA people, they're just doing what they're told to.
Yeah.
That was a catastrophic failure by President Obama, and thank God Trump came in, ended that program, and then eventually, we were able to destroy ISIS.
But
Well,
still, we have Al
as all
Qaeda now
ISIS.
in power in Syria. So the Operation Timber Sycamore was, let's say, Trump ended Operation Timber Sycamore, and he activated an economic warfare against Syria, which eventually choked the Syrian economy. And then the regional powers took the advantage to squeeze Assad even further. And now we have Jolani in power, who was a partner of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. On one part, it was successful from the US to minimize the strength of ISIS, but at the other hand, other regional powers were allies of the United States, such as Turkey, Qatar, and other players. They made sure that Jolani survived this war, and now he is in power. So in my opinion, Operation Timber Sycamore was two phases, one of which was the military warfare, and then we had the economic warfare. And eventually, this operation succeeded. Like what the empire wanted, let's say in this case, whether it was in London or in Washington, D.C., for a regime change to happen, the destruction of the state, and especially the Syrian military. Today, I watched the parade of the new Syrian army in Syria. I'm sorry, this is laughable when you see the new Syrian army on horses and they're calling for Gaza, that we are coming for you to save you. Buddy, Golan Heights, Quneitra, Dar'a are closer, and they are being occupied every day. Even large swaths of Syrian territories are occupied by the Israelis. And those who learned to shoot on the tanks against the Syrian army, they were really successful in destroying many of the Syrian army, the T-71s, the T-91s. Those were great tanks back in the day in Syria. Now, they don't see the Merkavas when they are rolling into Syria, and they are already in the peripheries of Damascus. They don't shoot on the Israeli tanks, which tells you that their support was conditional, and they were only allowed to fire against the Syrian army positions and not against Israeli occupation forces, which is occupying Syrian territory at the current moment. But this interesting conversation that you raised, and especially that you said literally, like, we helped in the creation of ISIS. And Kamal, when you listen to this, when you listen to Matthew saying we created ISIS, or in the US, they have made sure that ISIS would be created, does that fit with what you have seen in documents and field research? To what extent were jihadist networks intentionally used as tools against Damascus? And how much of ISIS and Nusra was a blowback versus a risk that Western and Gulf services were willing to run?
Absolutely. I think Matthew's 100% right. And that fits in with what I've seen in the field as well as at the policy level. And remember, very important thing that Matt said, unfortunately, innocent people being used for cannon fodder, right? So again, the guy I was working for at the time, the Chief of Defense Staff, said, if you want to do Syria, you need to do it with, hypothetically, of course, you always run these war games. If you really want to remove Assad, then put it 150,000 Western army to remove. But if you don't want to remove him, supporting these terrorist groups on the ground will just cause more damage. So it's what you might call a bleeding wound. They deliberately allowed these terrorist groups to bleed the Syrian army, whereby you bring them out, and people die on both sides. Just like Matthew said, there might be someone with a genuine grievance in parts of Syria whose villages have been blown up. But then to support them is not by giving them more arms. It's like you have rioters in New York or Chicago. If you start arming rioters, of course they will take on the NYPD or the Chicago PD. And in fact, President Trump has sent in a National Guard because some cities are getting out of control. But the idea that you're supporting extremists, it's not a secret. I'll repeat again. If you ask the Egyptians, the UAE, the Algerians, and even the non-Arab countries, if you ask the Pakistan army or that, how come all the political Muslim Brotherhood groups that are fighting those states are living in England? Not just living, they're supported and funded. Tunisia, the head of the Tunisian Brotherhood was living in London. The Egyptians, all in London. The Algerians, Emiratis, all the people fighting against the Emirates who are part of the Muslim Brotherhood are in London. So if it happens once, you can say it's a mistake. Twice, 5 times, Libya.
Kamal, just quickly, sorry
Sure.
to interrupt you. Is it a coincidence that also many of the Hamas leadership who were in Syria, who evacuated Syria in 2012, also ended up in London?
Exactly. It's not a coincidence. It's something that is used as a political tool going back to the 1920s, as you'd said, against Nasser in Egypt and wider Arab world in Syria. And one of the best ways to sum this up is for your viewers, if they Google the British Manchester arena bombings. So a few years ago, the first ever suicide bomb happened in the UK. It was a British-born Libyan who was sent by MI6 to fight in Libya, and then he came back. His whole family were on the payroll of the Brits, and the British families wanted to sue the security services, but the government vetoed it. So just Google Major General Jonathan Shaw, Major General John Holmes, David Richards, senior British generals spoke out against it because the army don't do politics. They were like, why are we training these guys? You know, so. And I think for the history and the record, unfortunately, for all the innocent lives lost, it's too late. But there should be a reckoning, and someone should question these things.
Is questioning enough in this case, Kamal? I mean, we've been questioning for over 14 years. I mean, I will speak about myself. I've been questioning it. I've been raising alarms, talking, convincing. I have met with researchers from think tanks like John McCain Institute and all this, the former President Jimmy Carter's NGO. And those are not, let's say, ignorant people. They're smart people. They know what's going on in Syria. And when you speak with them, they know the facts on the ground, and they tell you, those are the guys we have to deal with them. What does that even mean? Those are the guys that we have to deal with them if these guys are so harmful for the population of a country with 24 million people. We're talking about a country where half the population are either internally displaced or became refugees all around the world, including in Europe. Millions of them are here, and now they say they blame the refugees for the rise of the far-right groups in this on the continent. Meanwhile, the people who waged this operation inside Syria, they don't take accountability for the mayhem they have created, which led to the refugee crisis in Europe as well. So is speaking about it enough? What can we do beyond speaking and raising alarms? We're talking about papers, we're talking about podcasts, we're talking about personal communication with people. For me, I have come to the conclusion that these people do not have goodwill. Like, their intentions are so bad toward the Syrian people that they knowingly continued in this regime change operation, despite all the consequences. They know what is going on. They have a clear goal. It's about geopolitics. It's about the security of Israel. It's about the financial reasons to invest in the country. And now they have reached to their goals. So to hell with the Syrian people.
No, so that's a fair point. And these people aren't stupid, as you said, you know, from whether it's policymakers, research institutes. So the enablers, or the people that are used as cannon fodder, they might not be fully aware. They might have genuine aspirations for their countries and societies, but certainly the enablers aren't. And I guess, speaking out, as you said, there have been podcasts, there have been senior officials spoken out against this. If the top generals, if the top ambassadors, if the top operators like Matt or advisors like me are speaking out, actually what happens is you lose your job and you get in trouble with the authorities. And Tucker Carlson famously said a few weeks ago, the UK has now arrested more people for freedom of speech than the Russians and Chinese. Sure, they might be more sophisticated and someone will stop you at the airport like, oh, excuse me, sir, can you please follow us to this room? So it might be a bit different to bundling you in a van, but the amount of people being stopped, if you go against the narrative, that freedom of speech is gone. Like J.D. Vance said about the UK especially, or Tucker. And so Europe, and, you know, of course, Europe is moving towards a very, you can't speak out. If you speak out, there are sophisticated ways of getting to you. It's no longer, you know, so there won't be any accountability. Look at Tony Blair. He's now become kind of the godfather of the Gaza plan, despite of all the horrors of the Iraq war and his role in it. He's minting hundreds of millions from the Tony Blair Institute.
Yeah, just to confirm your point, Kamal, in this case, when I came to Germany in 2015, and I mean, I started my YouTube channel in 2017. And yes, at the beginning, I was not as professional as I try to be now. We pass through different phases in life. When you're in 25, it's different when you're 38. Of course, when I started, I was more sensationalist. I was more patriotic. I want to defend my country. I spoke with more emotions, etc. But I was genuine in trying to tell the people that there is a different side of the story. And just to confirm your point in this case, as I live in Germany, they say you have a freedom of speech, you have a freedom of opinion, you have, if you're a journalist, you have the right to speak up your mind, right? But there are legal ways, even in Germany, to deprive you of the right to speak your mind. For example, they come and tell you, we don't consider you a journalist. Who says you're a journalist? We consider you a propagandist, for example. So they take away your right to speak in this case, and they even send you to court. In my case, they tried actively to deport me to Syria while I was here a refugee in Germany. They took away my asylum, and I was probably the first case in Germany. They tried to deport me back to Syria, saying, "Oh, if you feel like Assad is better than these rebels, then go and live under Assad," right? And had they been successful in deporting Mac to Syria and the regime change happened, what would have happened to me then? So would the German government would they be responsible for my killing? No, they would have probably celebrated it, right? So this is what I'm trying to say. There are so many Syrians also who came to Germany. They're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to say, no, I didn't escape from Assad. I escaped from ISIS, or I escaped from Nusra. So they engineered or pressed on the people so much that if you want to receive an asylum, you have to say you're running from Assad, right? And they have created this environment deliberately. And those who spoke against this narrative, they were threatened. They lost scholarships. You cannot even find a job. Like since 2016 today, I cannot find a job in Germany. Thank God that I have this YouTube channel that I can at least survive, right? Otherwise, it is very difficult for the people. I agree with you. The people who work in these NGOs, in my opinion, they do it deliberately. And when you speak with them privately, you sense that they know what is going on underground. And what they have done is so harmful to the extent that some people have, in my opinion, blood in their hands, unfortunately. Matthew, my friend, I want to move with you to another chapter in today's conversation: proxies, moderates, FSA, and YPG versus ISIS. You have operated alongside both the Free Syrian Army and the Kurdish YPG against ISIS. How would you compare those two partners in capability, in political agenda, and in how far you could trust them? And how did Washington's attitude toward them change as the war evolved?
Definitely. So after the Trump, before Trump was able to dismantle the CIA program that was, arming, equipping, and training the Syrians, Obama started the Free Syrian Army push, which was the next failed thing that Obama did, because essentially what we were doing was kind of an exact carbon copy of the previous program, while still running, but with less equipment, less funding, much lower levels of firepower, vehicles. I mean, it was at some points. I had to build supply lines and pitch it to just try to get bandages to these guys, in certain parts of Syria. So it was a complete and catastrophic failure again, because all we ended up doing was giving guys just enough to feel froggy enough to fight, and then they go fight and they get just decimated by ISIS, by Nusra, and by the Syrian regime. So that program ended very quickly, and the first program was a catastrophic failure, and what ended up being done with it, right? A lot of death in the beginning, but then they started to do other things and band together, of course, with ISIS, Nusra, and all that. But the Free Syrian Army program was probably one of I would say, the biggest failures of the Obama administration with that push, because All we did was get those people killed. And so the Free Syrian Army was pretty much a joke. And then, thank God, President Trump came into office and ended the first program. And we switched from the Free Syrian Army program to the YPG, and then that's when things started to change. And again, nothing against the Syrians. It was all that were a part of the Free Syrian Army. It was just the setup, the funding, what they were given was not in any way, shape, form, or fashion enough to be able to fight the terrorist groups and to fight the Assad regime at that time. Now that Russia had also entered the ball game, so now it's not just Assad. Now you have Russian assets, tanks, equipment, fighter jets, and hardened Russian fighters from Russian special operations to the Wagner Group. You had a whole different mess in Syria now. You've got U.S. special operations, Russian special operations, conventional army assets on both sides. Those Free Syrian Army guys did not stand a chance. So with the partnership we have with the YPG, that's when things really started to change and work. The Kurdish at the time, they were hardened fighters. They were very well organized. More funding came in from President Trump. A lot more. We've supported them with, obviously, with the air support was probably the key to all of this. We were able to take out most of the tanks and equipment and things that ISIS had acquired at the time. From the Predator drones, all the different types of drones and Hellfires that were always readily available to support the YPG with. The YPG couldn't lose, because there was an actual good plan built around the YPG, to destroy ISIS. So when I was there, it was 2017 into 2018, on the YPG side, we were pretty successful, and I would say we were about 90% done with cleaning up ISIS out of eastern Syria. But the whole issue again was now you've got Russia, on the battlefield. So Russia did a lot to fight ISIS and then push them out. So I forget the name of the river off the top of my head that kind of runs. It's not perfectly east to west through Syria, but a little bit north. I would say northwest to southeast. That was like the river, the demarcation line between the Russian forces and the U.S. forces, and we were all pushing ISIS to the river and then out towards Iraq, and that ended up being a very successful operation, and what ended up, at least at that time, to be the destruction of ISIS when Trump declared that ISIS had been defeated. But in that time, we ended up in, I think they call it the Battle of Qashm now. It was my team, some guys from the unit, and then a handful, like 4 Marines, that ended up in a ground war against about 600 Russian Wagner forces. It's pretty famously talked about today, where there's about 600 of them versus about less than 40 of us, and had the pretty much every jet and bomber in the U.S. military in the Middle East not shown up that night, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. But it was, just little things like that just could happen at that point, because now it's not just America, now it's not just Britain or France that's in Syria. Now you've got Russia and formidable forces through the Wagner paramilitary group. So the YPG part of this fitting in, though, is that they played nice, they trained well, they fought well, but they finally, for the first time since the war in Syria started, there was formidable U.S. military assets on the ground, fighting with them, supporting them, and then the Air Force entities supporting them as well. So that's when the whole game started to change. And again, it's just being from being some of the very first group of guys involved from America involved in the Syrian war, all the way through, the initial quote unquote defeat of ISIS, and then from the train and equip program to the Free Syrian Army, then through seeing on the YPG, it just showed me just the complete, how how bad the Obama administration's policy and chaos that they started in Syria led to so many deaths. American tax dollars, fighting each other, American soldiers essentially without even knowing it at some nights, fighting and shooting at each other. And all these proxy militaries that could then now be, because the second you build up a military and you say that you have support and you give them enough, lethal weapons to be, to be dangerous, and then you just pull the rug out from under them and say, all right, guys, good luck. Well, I mean, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to go to the next guy who's going to take care of them, whether it's al-Nusra, whether that's ISIS, whether that's Russia, whether the Wagner Group, or any other entity that some other countries pushing and fighting. Because you had Turkey using proxy militaries in the country. Obviously, there was money coming in from the wealthy Gulf, nations, funding God knows what in the country, U.S. policy, British policy, French policy, and then the Russian military. I mean, Syria was a dumpster fire, man. And unfortunately, it still in a lot of ways is. And I believe, and again, you have to go back to the why. And, why is the one of the biggest terrorist groups that the world's ever seen, why have they never attacked Israel? Right? Why have they never even fired one bullet into Israel? And they're right there. And it just takes me back to what's the purpose, right? And so once I started to learn, and this is after I got out of the military, and I really started to research things. I'd always studied religion. You have to know Judaism, Islam, and Christianity to be able to sit in meetings and operate at a high level, in the Middle East. You have to know your religion. You have to know why people are doing what they're doing. But the other side of this, the thing that I really started to see once I got out, was the Israeli influence behind all of this. And then what I believe is the purpose and why Syria is so destabilized right now. Obviously, you're seeing the genocide and the chaos that's happening in Gaza and Palestine. You're seeing, southern Lebanon starting to look a little bit like Gaza from all the bombing and things that have gone on there. And I lived in Lebanon for years. I love the Lebanese people. Lebanon was an amazing place. And you're starting to see southern Lebanon turn into that. And then you're seeing now the chaos in Syria, the Druids, if I'm saying that group right, that's constantly attacking, the Assyrian Christians. And then you've got obviously the ISIS involvement. The leader of ISIS is now running the country, and no one ever messes with Israel, but they sure do kill a lot of Christians and a lot of Muslims. And, it's a mess, man. And, I don't feel personally responsible for it in the fact of, I wasn't making the decisions, and I don't think even a lot of times Obama and Trump are making decisions. I think there's a deep state globalist narrative behind this scene. Obviously, a lot of it was Israeli money and influence too. I was used just like cannon fodder as well, man. I could have just as easily been killed in all of this mess, and a lot of my brothers were. So it's looking back at everything and just seeing this. It's in all the chaos, order through chaos, right? It always goes back to that for me. You cannot create order without chaos. You cannot create control without chaos. And I just believe that there's the puppet master behind all of this is not anyone that we're talking about right now.
Indeed, they are the executive managers, basically, of their countries. They're not really making the decision making. They're not really putting the policies. But you have really people in the shadow who have invested interest in these wars, destructions, and the misery in the people's lives. You see faces are changing, politicians are coming and going, democratic elections, and one party comes and one party goes. But then the major headlines basically remain intact in this case, which is an indication that those are not the people who are making the decisions at the end of the day when it comes to strategic decisions like getting involved in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. Those were really, in my opinion, beyond the capacity of individuals in the United States, but rather the military-industrial complex, as you mentioned, and also there are so many other influential people. Kamal, I think I would like to go with you to the UK a little bit. You have written that ignorant British policy helped inflame the Syrian war. You took very senior UK officials to Syria. Why the UK took a hardline position when the US and Saudi Arabia were at some point ready to compromise with Damascus?
Yeah, this remains a mystery to me. And one can only see malicious, facetious attempt or content towards Damascus in the specific stance of Syria, because we're talking about the UK. The Syrian president spent time in the UK when he was studying to be an ophthalmologist. His wife is British born. Before the war in Syria started, 86 members of British Parliament visited Damascus. Assad met the Queen. No one gets to meet the Queen unless you're a royal family member. So it doesn't make sense to me from Assad being the angel and his wife being the Princess Diana of the Middle East. Overnight, they become the bad guys, you know. And as I said, personally, I know during the first few months of the war, the British sent a very high-level military security delegation. I had helped organize it. They went, and this I don't think has been said before online, that when they came back, they said things aren't as bad as we are saying. You know, Assad's willing to talk. Sure, some excesses have happened. Some innocent people have been killed, but you know, we shouldn't jump on the regime gun just as yet. But that's where it stopped. No one wanted to go further, just like we saw from the Arab League when the Sudanese general went and said, well, things are bad, but not as bad as people are saying, and this war can be stopped. And now I'm talking about the first few months. Once the 6 months have passed, it's too late. All hell broke loose and war crimes committed on all fronts. It's too late. But UK was part and parcel of something which to this day I don't understand. The only thing I can say is there's a historical relevance. When you connect all the dots, all the brotherhood live in London, all the leadership lives in London, from North Africa all the way to Southeast Asia. So it's some kind of leverage to control these societies which predominantly Muslim populations, but also upsetting sectarian balance. It's not a surprise that Nur al-Maliki, Ayad al-Alawi, who were not brotherhood, but they were anti-Saddam guys, they were living in London, you know. So it almost happens behind every war in the Middle East. America has the guns and the money, but you know, there's always some dossier that comes from UK. Even the Christine dossier. Yeah,
the psyops come from the British.
Even if you look at Suez, President Eisenhower, who was, I think, one of the best presidents the US had, Eisenhower told the British to shut up when they kept continuing trying to do Suez, and you know the Americans weren't having it. And Eisenhower was also the last American president who had warned against the military-industrial complex and the nuclear weapons or going into Israel. You know, and yet stopping that program that could allow atomic power to come to Israel just in the 50s. But going to the British, as I said, they knew everything, so they cannot claim that, oh, we didn't know. And as I said, if the leading British generals, not one, not two, not three, and you know, people can Google my name and read the articles, they've all given interviews on record, and they got in trouble for it. I took 2 senior members of David Cameron's cabinet. One was actually stopped at the airport. You can't go. Where's the freedom of speech there? And most of my trips, none of them are for propaganda. Assad didn't put the videos up. There were no pictures of these trips. So they were all done for a particular purpose. Let's try to solve this. And the Saudis had, MBS is on record by saying when he took over for Mohammed bin Naif as crown prince, he was very clear. He stopped the funding of the terrorist groups that bin Naif was doing. And of course, the Saudis had changed the policy towards Syria. Of course, Qatar is the elephant in the room, but I would say UK, France, and again, I will go on record saying here that American officials came to London to meet various people doing back channels, but the British weren't interested. So the senior most Americans from the Trump administration, first time, 2017-18, and the incoming Biden administration in 2020-21 were in London to meet back channels from Damascus and the Saudis. And guess what? The UK torpedoed it, in fact, sanctioned some people who were involved
Just
in the
like
meetings.
in Ukraine.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate. We can see now, whilst Trump is trying to end the war in Ukraine, and it's open how corrupt Zelensky is. Zelensky is welcomed in London. So it's not just a brotherhood thing. It's also Zelensky's part of the brotherhood, perhaps as well. Who knows? It goes beyond just religion, perhaps. Who knows?
Yeah. Zelensky congratulated the Syrian people for the liberation and finally receiving their freedom after 1 year of ousting Assad yesterday.
Yeah.
I think in this case there is a pattern, a British pattern, let's say, in destabilizing certain regions and leaving the way it is until it is cooked enough, and then impose all these sanctions so it can be rotten from within the country itself and change the regime afterwards. I think the Brits are not spending as much money as the Qataris and the Americans, because the CIA spent $1 billion per year on Syria, but they are, let's say, skilled in psychological operations, in inventing organizations underground, for example, the White Helmets, and also investing in certain individuals in their own country and preparing them as future leaders in other countries.
Absolutely, yeah.
I can name you many of them now in Syria with Jolani. And they have never stepped inside Syria before.
No, absolutely. And just very briefly, as I mentioned Jonathan Powell. So Jonathan Powell, who was Tony Blair's chief of staff, and I actually visited Damascus many times when Blair was the prime minister in the early 2000s, when, as I said, Assad was welcome to meet the Queen. It's not a surprise that this guy led the effort to mentoring Jolani's team in Idlib. And it's all in the open now. It's in the press. There was an article in The Economist magazine that people are questioning, how can you be someone, and by the way, he's also the guy behind the Taliban. So, so all of a sudden the Taliban, the moderate Taliban, really? There was never going to be a moderate Taliban. And people forget that Afghanistan was a perfectly normal country. When people say, oh, the Afghans are crazy, of course they're not. That's a racist argument. Afghanistan was a very moderate country in the 60s and 70s. Yeah, you could do whatever you want, but years and years of funneling jihadis. And again, it goes back to in many cases, UK.
Indeed. Matthew, my friend, there is a very important incident that you lived personally, and this is the Battle of Khasham, if I'm not butchering the name, the US versus Wagner groups. So let's talk about that, the clash that killed a large number of Wagner-linked fighters near Deir Zor. From your professional perspective, what does that battle tell us about how close the US and Russia actually came to direct war in Syria? How carefully choreographed was escalation control in reality?
No, definitely. So, that night was one that kind of caught all of us off guard, to be perfectly honest. My team had been pushing, south towards said river. I'm sorry, I'm on my phone right now, so I can't Google the name of it. But we were pushing ISIS towards the river, and we had occupied what used to be a Conoco natural gas field. So that was one of the key pieces of, terrain, and really just the largest money maker in eastern Syria was that natural gas field. Yeah. So Russia wanted it. Obviously, the Wagner Group especially, they're war profiteers, they're paramilitary contractors. They wanted to control it because, again, you get that built up and secured, that's hundreds of millions of dollars, and a day even with getting that production up and for that part of the region. So we had an agreement that we would stay north of the river, that Russia would stay to the south of the river, and then nobody had really messed that up. So one night we're at the Conoco field. I don't believe Russia knew that we were there. We had set up a headquarters pretty recently at the Conoco field. It was mostly YPG fighters, and the Russia started to build these military bridges across the river, and we started watching tanks roll across the river and armored personnel carriers roll across the river, and then about 600-700 fighters come across the river, and then 8 artillery pieces come across the river, and we're like, oh shit, this is not good. So at that time our command had gotten on with at that time Secretary of Defense Mattis, and Mattis eventually gave the order that if they attack, kill them. Well, we're like, again, there's tanks, there's armored personnel carriers, there's 8 artillery pieces, and I'm sure you're familiar with artillery. It hits the ground, everybody's dead within about 100-meter radius. There's a lot of stuff, and there's, about 40 of us, and the largest weapon that we had on the ground with us was a few 50 cal machine guns, and then 600 plus soldiers of them. So, if they came at us, we would die. There's no way we're winning that fight, special forces or not. So we had a a Predator drone, MQ-9 above us at the time, I forget which one. And they set up the artillery guns. One of the things that you have to do with artillery is you have to fire around in order and start to zero the guns, essentially, right? Get them registered. Well, we smoked one of the guns. We realized they were firing, so we smoked one of the guns with a Hellfire, and on the TV we had, or the feed from the Hellfire, or I'm sorry, the MQ-9. We were able to watch all the guys fly up into the air, bodies go everywhere, and come off of the gun, and we're like, all right, now they know America's here. Well, I think they just assumed America had sent a drone down. They didn't realize, I think still at this point, that American soldiers were there. So the guys were still alive, and maybe a fresh crew. They all ran to the gun, and they were getting it ready to fire again. So we used the last Hellfire missile on the gun. Bodies went flying. They all came back. And once they continued to fire, we're like, oh shit. Now we had no jets on station, bombers on station at that time. We were not expecting them to attack. That was not, part of the expectation. So the guys that were directly on, I would say, this berm that we had at the conical oil fields, because we named it Castle Black. So at that time, Game of Thrones was a big TV show. I don't know if you guys remember that or have seen it, but that was the most popular TV show in the world at the time. So we were naming all the places after things in Game of Thrones. Some guy who gets paid too much to do nothing in an office in DC changed the battle to the Battle of Kasham. So we named it Castle Black, and that was, the last, and the wall was, the wall for the Ice Walkers, and that's what we were calling the Russians, just jokingly, right? And so they came, and they started to assault across the desert, and the guys on that berm. I was not part of the berm team. I was in a vehicle with the commander of a tier 1 unit and a couple other people, and moving around the battlefield, and they just started. They were eating artillery. Directly, firing 50 cals and machine guns at the Russians as they came across the desert, and things were about to get really bad. Luckily, no artillery directly hit the guys, or they would have all died. One piece of artillery hit the berm. On the other side, a couple guys got their bell rung. But that night, almost every jet and bomber in the U.S. military in the Middle East showed up after about 40 minutes. And I think it was probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life, to watch what, the U.S. Air Force, Navy assets as well were capable of, and everything in the desert as, was just starting to light on fire. All the tanks, all of the aircraft, armored personnel carriers. And, we had, intercepted transmissions of the Russians. I think a lot of them have been leaked on, YouTube and things like that now. They're decimating, they're killing us, get us out of here. And I think that night there was somewhere between 400 to 600 of them that died, on that field, all because of miscommunication. Yeah. Sean Ryan had Sean Ryan podcast. He had a guy who wrote a book about that night from the Wagner perspective. I haven't read the book yet. I've actually talked to the author, and we're going to chat here sometime soon. But there's a lot of people trying to write books, and I think someone's trying to make a movie about that night right now. And just like they always do with anything significant that happens. But I will say this is that that was a catastrophic breakdown in communication and battlefield awareness, because there wasn't direct lines between us and the Russians on the ground. There was only diplomatic lines, and general to general kind of stuff. Yeah. So it got a lot of people killed that night. But that just shows you, and that was a prime example, I think, for everyone at that time, just how fragile the situation in Syria was. Luckily, that did not spill into more war. They left me there for another week or two, because I had kind of been one of the JTAC orchestrators of that thing, and they thought it was going to happen again a week later, and they sent my rest of my team got to go home, and me and one of the commanders got sent back down there, and they're like, all right, if it happens again, you guys are in charge. And just like, damn it, because it was it's a place no one wanted to be. We didn't want to be
Yeah.
fighting Russia. We weren't trying to go toe to toe with a conventional military or, a Wagner group, which might as well be a conventional military, and Spetsnaz. That just was not the card. But it just shows you that not only were the Syrian people being used as cannon fodder for this whole thing. I mean, obviously, when you sign up, you're being used as cannon fodder for some type of agenda. And still, I look back at the wars, the people that were lost over there, all the different phases, from creating the first, resistance groups, if you'll call them that, to fight the Assad regime, to then the Free Syrian Army, to the YPG push, to the night we went to war with Russia. If you just, I was one of the, there's other Americans, but there's a handful of us that were involved in Syria from day one, is the way I like to say it, almost until the end of the major conflict. And having that perspective and seeing it all, man, and now looking back, I'm 42 now. I've got 3 daughters. I still do intel, still fight war. But just looking back at that whole those chapters of my life, I don't believe in regrets, but there's definitely, a lot of pain, I guess you could say, felt for all the people that lost their lives and things that I was involved in, either directly or indirectly, because there was just no reason for any of them to die. And then that's what led me again to more studying to understand really what was behind all this, because it wasn't 9/11 in and of itself. It wasn't the American invasion of Iraq. There's an agenda in the Middle East right now, and I think the Middle East is feeling it. I think people are living it, because if you go back to the Brits, and not to throw the Brits under the bus, Kamal, but from the Balfour Agreement to drawing the lines in the sand in the Middle East to creating countries in the middle of tribes, in the middle of Sunni and Shia and different variations of Islam, and pretty much sending the Middle East into a continuous destabilization, just the way the lines in the countries were created, to then also the gifting of Israel to Lord Rothschild in 1917. The British Parliament gifted Israel to Lord Rothschild on behalf of the king. And then, the flooding of Israel with European Ashkenazi Jews that have never been to Palestine, their ancestors were never from Palestine, and just flooding Palestine with those people and creating them through violence and genocide, and the 3 militias, Lehi, Ergon, and Haganah, securing and creating Israel, and then Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, having to name Levi and Ergon international terrorist groups, and and now you're seeing the IDF act like terrorists and committing genocide in Gaza, which has been called that by multiple European organizations and American organizations at this point too. You start to see. And then you hear about all the Israeli soldiers now are wearing the Greater Israel patch, right? That encompasses Syria and Babylon and Iraq and parts of Egypt and all of Lebanon. And you're like, well, wait a second. And you go all the way back to the dancing Israelis and the Israeli art students in 9/11. And then you go all the way up to the patches they're wearing on their shoulder, the things they talk about. And sorry for a little bit of a rant, but just to make this all clear and why it's, made sense to me. And now you look at, I found a Look magazine article from January 17th, 1962, of David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, saying the purpose of Israel is to create a United Nations, a truly United Nations, to end all nation states, to create one world government, to create one world court, and that Jerusalem will be the headquarters of the court, and a shrine to the prophets will be built in Jerusalem. You're talking New World Order, you're talking globalization stuff, and the guy who created Israel, and Israel who's behind all of this chaos, I believe, from 9/11 to the Arab Spring to everything that's happening in all the countries around Israel right now, all the death, destruction, and chaos. And then you look at the plans. David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, told us the playbook. He said the plan is to get to globalization. And when you look at those wars started, what happened? You flood, Europe and America with Islamic immigrants, right? Because they have to leave their home, because they're not fleeing the government, they're fleeing ISIS, they're fleeing al-Nusra, they're fleeing terrorist groups, they're fleeing murder. They can't get a job. There's nowhere to work. They're starving. They're hungry. Their women are being raped. You rightfully understand why they're fleeing. But now you have tens of millions of Muslims in Europe and America who have, started to, they're being attacked by the nation states that they're in for being there because they feel like they're taking over and changing the demographics. And then you have people inside of the Islamic groups starting to get a little more radical, and whether that's false flag or money being pushed in. So I think you're about to see the world kind of descend into chaos from all this. And this is the part I hate the most is we talk about what's happening in Syria, but I think you're about to see a bigger fire, a bigger burn, more chaos that's being created. And it all goes back to a little tiny nation in the Middle East that was gifted to Lord Rothschild in 1917 and founded by Ben Gurion in 1948, and has, through financial control and, in my opinion, being the puppet masters behind the scenes, we're about to really see the true reason for 9/11, the destabilization of Syria and all that as we get closer to 2030 with globalization and order through chaos. Because I really believe, again, the Muslim people are about to be used for chaos throughout Europe and throughout America. And you're about to see a lot of money and a lot of radical rhetoric start up inside of Europe and start inside of America that is not being done by the Muslim people. And let me make that very clear. I think, again, they're going to be used as pawns for the agenda and the goals of another nation.
I think there is definitely going to be destabilization efforts, especially in Europe.
100%.
And I see clear patterns of using the religion of these migrants and the refugees in Europe as a pushing point against you're telling Europeans that you have to go back to your identity, you have to become a nationalist, and those Muslims are going to change the demographics. But when these millions of group of people were coming to Europe, similar NGOs were facilitating the arrival of the people in Europe, and it was not allowed to say any word against at least the root cause of the refugee crisis, right, in 2015, 2016 in Europe. But now it's open in the air, especially you see on X, there is a clear mobilization of the public opinion against this particular group, which in my opinion is not spontaneous. And I agree, there is going to be a backlash sooner or later in Europe. That's why I feel like I have to leave as soon as possible, because I can see clearly it is coming step by step. But there is one group that we don't speak about them, and this is the last point, Kamal, the Christians. The Christians, we discussed about ISIS, we discussed covert operations, we discussed regime change wars, great power rivalry. Why is the issue of the Christians of Syria and the Middle East never taken into account when we speak about all these miseries, destructions, refugees, like as if they don't exist? What is happening?
Absolutely. I mean, I think I remember, in the early days of the war in Syria, I think Tucker Carlson was the only one in mainstream media at the time, Fox News, saying, how come every war America starts ends up wiping out the Christian population of wherever they are, starting with Iraq, Syria, Lebanese civil war, where the Christians used to be more than 60% of Lebanon and dropped to 35-40%. We're seeing it now happening in Palestine. No one talks about it. In fact, again, I can tell you firsthand from England, 2 former archbishops of Canterbury, and for those of you not familiar, the Church of England's highest bishop is the Archbishop of Canterbury. They traveled to Syria. I was in the delegation. 6 senior priests traveled to Syria to talk about the killings of the Christian. And guess what? When they came back, they were all given a warning by the British government, don't you talk about the Christians. So it's almost I cannot think this is a coincidence that the senior-most priests of a country are warned by their own government, don't get involved, this has nothing to do with Christians. Well, so there is a deliberate attempt for re-engineering, and, let's be honest, with all Syria is the land that gave birth to Christianity. It's the only country in the world that speaks the language of Christ, Aramaic. You've got ancient populations from the Greek Orthodox to the Armenians, who were the original people of this land before the Arabs got here. And all of a sudden, they are told you are foreigners, you don't belong here, or you came with the French, or you came with the Russians. Revisionist history. Same with Iraq. Over 1 million Christians were there during Saddam's time, and what happens now? No one talks about what's happening in Jerusalem now, that the Orthodox Church and the Armenian Church, which are the largest landowners in Jerusalem, their property is being stolen, confiscated, and you can't really speak out against it. Sure, people have started speaking out against it. You got Tucker, you've got Matthew, you got Sean Ryan, but it's a limited. And I think for the first time, and I really think Syria pushed this to the edge, Syria brought the Eastern Christianity into American headlines. Before, most people wouldn't even know there are Christians in the Middle East because, hey, all Arabs are Muslim terrorists. That's the way Hollywood would stream it, not knowing that they are the most ancient denominations of Christians, going back to the Greek speakers, the Aramaics, the Armenians, the Chaldeans, the Syriacs. But they have systematically been either killed, persecuted, or they've been told to leave. So, hey, you want a visa, come out. But actually, why are you depopulating these areas? And then to look the other way. And when it suits them, they can use, there are all these NGOs in America, they're like, oh, we are helping the poor trafficked Christians. Well, actually, why does it have to come to that? Why does it have to come where you need to pull them out from their homeland when there is a terror army on the doorstep? And same thing happened in Nigeria. No one talks about Nigeria, then all of a sudden it's in the headlines. So that goes again to the news cycles, but especially in Syria and the Holy Land, Christians have been deliberately driven out, killed to do a population complete remarcation of the Middle East.
I just want to give you an example. My family, we are ethnic Armenians, Christian Orthodox. And my family, I remember during the New Year, we celebrate in one place. And one of my family members had a restaurant in Aleppo. And we were around 100 people. New Year, 100 Christian ethnic Armenians, we gather together, we celebrate together. And now, this is in Aleppo, now we have only 2 of them in Syria. It was 0, recently it became 2 again. Only 2. So this is a pattern that we have seen in different places, starting from Qamishli Hasake, and then when the war started in Syria in 2011, the NGOs opened the gates, the doors, only for Christians. If you manage to go to Lebanon, to Beirut, and you register yourself in the UN or the parallel NGOs, they would take you in a matter of a few months to Australia, to Canada, to Germany, to Switzerland, in different places around the world. Only you have to be Christian. So they ask for the baptism certificate from the church, and that allows. I mean, I'm not saying these people aren't happy now in their new places, because at least they are enjoying some safety and security. But I'm also saying this was an attempt to empty Syria from its Christian presence. And in my opinion, there are so many reasons for it, but one of which is the identity of Syria. It has different pillars, right? One of them are the Muslims, the others are the Kurds, and one of them is the Christians. They destroyed the Syrian identity, and they wanted to destroy the Syrian identity. And another pillar of the Syrian identity was the ancient artifacts and the ancient cities and the towns, like, for example, Palmyra and Ma'lula. That's why they destroyed them. ISIS was used to destroy these ancient cities, and also Nusra, which they destroyed partially, Ma'lula, because our belonging to that land is because of our identity. We feel belonging to that place because we have a strong sense of identity to that country. If you destroy the identity, then there is nothing left for you to defend that country. You feel you don't belong to that country any longer. And that's why they pacified the Syrian people. They also, not only the Christians, of course, the Muslims, they are now selling them the illusion that, you have electricity 24. So you should be happy, right? But you lost half your country to foreign occupiers. Israel is on the periphery of Damascus. Your electricity is coming from outside, not you're importing them. Everything you import now in Syria, there is no national economy, there is no sovereignty, there is no independent decision-making, but the people are celebrating in the streets. And this reminds me of what the WEF, World Economic Forum, promised to the people, saying, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And they basically sold this to the Syrians. You will not own your country and you will be happy. You will celebrate in the streets. It's a complete mass psychosis of the people celebrating the demise of their nations and selling them as a victory. So I really appreciate that people like you, my friends, exist. We agree on many things and we disagree on other things. And this is an important conversation that we have to shed light on the situation, not only in Syria, but the real forces driving this type of wars, not only in Syria, in different places around the world. And when I said talking about it is not enough, I think we're doing more than talking, because we are building bridges. I'm building a bridge with Kamal. Kamal is building a bridge with Matthew, and we are communicating now. We have to bring, we have to create a general understanding of how the world operates, and that we are all in this together. If they normalize this type of warfare in Gaza, believe me, this will be repeated in different places around the world, and this could be used against you. And the similar thing that happened in Syria. That's why we try to have this type of conversations with you guys. So Matthew, Kamal, thank you so much, both, for this very frank, fascinating, and detailed conversation. I really appreciate you guys that you dedicated all this time for the audience of Syriana Analysis, and for me, I learned a lot from you, so thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
With pleasure. And to everyone watching this, thank you so much, guys, for tuning in. If this gave you a different perspective from what you hear on mainstream media, please like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Syriana Analysis. And also, the links of Matthew are in the description below. You have to hit him a follow on X. I think he recently started his X. His Instagram is blowing up already. I have seen it. He has tens of thousands of followers, but he's new on X, and most of you are on X, guys. So go and hit him a follow. If you found this also content helpful for you and you like to support my independent work, you can simply become a patron. The link is scrolling on the screen, patreon.com/Syriana Analysis. And I will see you tomorrow. Peace be upon you guys and upon your families, and peace be upon you, Kamal. Peace be upon you, Matthew. Salam.